hello, Canada, and welcome to another episode of the Maple Pill. As always, I'm your host, Matt McKeever, and it's episode 21. We're coming off of another weekend of the Trucker Freedom Convoy protests, so we're going to be doing another special episode where essentially I'm just going to be breaking down for you a bunch of the different highlights and news around this weekend. So in case you guys were living under a rock, or maybe you were out in the middle of the protest rather than reading up and staying on top of everything that's going on, today we're going to be covering a bunch of different things. In part, we're going to be covering how the Ottawa police and the government in general, so both at the municipal, so the city level, as well as the provincial and federal level, how it seems like their narrative is changing, and they're definitely pivoting to a much more aggressive or standoffish response towards the truckers. We're also going to be talking about a hit and run or maybe a terrorist attack in Winnipeg. And again, it really just kind of depends upon your perspective and whether you believe there was underlying motivations in regards to that vehicle incident in Winnipeg during one of the protests. We're also going to be talking about an attempted arson story related to Ottawa. And again, there appears to be a little bit more to this story than meets the eye. And then finally, we're also going to be covering some of the misinformation that I saw making the rounds on social media, as well as in some of the mainstream news outlets. We're also going to be talking about how the anti-hate organization in Canada, which is funded by the Canadian government, appears to be spreading misinformation. We're going to be covering that and a lot more in tonight's special update in regards to everything going on with the trucker protests. For those of you that are participating, that are boots on the ground, whether you're, in Alberta or any other province, or if you're in Ottawa, our capital city, let me know in the comment section, what's been your personal experience? What are you seeing? And before we even jump into it, I just want to highlight, I'm blown away and so impressed by the organization and the deft handling of all this by the organizers of the trucker protest convoy, as well as by just every participant. Honestly, I was really scared going into this weekend that the government was trying to back them into a corner in order to drive a reaction. And they literally, I'm just blown away. And so it's amazing. If you're part of the individuals participating in that, again, a tip of the hat to you guys. You guys are absolutely crushing it. I think you're doing a great example of how to go about a protest of this nature. And in fact, I can't help but think that, a couple of years from now, we'll probably start to see some books come out about the changing atmosphere around how to organize a protest, as well as I'm sure that we'll also see governments and police organizations updating their manuals in order to react or counteract against protests of this nature, because this really feels different. Originally, when this started off, I was of the perspective it felt a lot like Occupy Wall Street, where it's a bunch of different groups that are relatively disorganized that all just have a passion and a frustration with the administration as well as politicians. And while that may still be true, certainly the way they've been able to harness this into productive protesting is just, I don't know, it blows my mind. And again, I'm wildly impressed by my fellow Canucks. So again, thank you to all the Canadians out there making this protest not only wildly important for our individual freedoms and personal sovereignty, but also for doing it in the most Canadian manner I could think of. I can't help but think that a lot of politicians that talked about this being a fringe minority, that tried to really paint with a negative brush the protesters as well as the organizers, I feel like you're literally just driving them crazy at this point in time. That's the politicians and administration, because they want to see a reaction. They want to be able to have proof that you're evil, that you're the scum of the earth, that you're racist and all that. And it seems like you couldn't ask for a better counter narrative from the protesters by just being upstanding Canadians that are, shoveling sidewalks, that are feeding the homeless, that are just singing and dancing and protesting in very peaceful manners. And again, we're going to cover about some of the new restrictions going on in Ottawa as well. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to share this on Twitter that I saw making the rounds. So we'll get the screen share up here. And I don't know if you guys, remember Where's Waldo? I was a huge fan of Where's Waldo back in the day, loved it in grade school, and just wondered, can you guys find the Prime Minister? And so I know he's pretty good at hiding, but I think I see him bottom right-hand corner, Prime Minister Blackface. It was the blackface that was kind of hiding him. He's right there. There he is. So again, thought that was a fun way to start things off. Now, talking about the protests and updates, as we've been doing for a lot of these trucker update videos, link in the video description down below to all the resources. But the first one I want to share with you is from True North. and just a recap of day 15 of the Truckers for Freedom Convoy. And again, I think True North is doing some of the best reporting right now. So really appreciate the independent journalists, their help driving real reporting rather than the mainstream media, which is just fear mongering and essentially just parroting, or they're the propaganda wing now of the government. So from this article, on day 15 of the Truckers for Freedom Convoy, the mayor of Ottawa declared a state of emergency. Police began arresting people who provided truckers with gasoline and other supplies, and the legacy media cheered it all on. Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson declared a state of emergency on Sunday, with City Hall posting the following explainer. Declaring a state of emergency reflects the serious danger and threat to the safety and security of residents posed by the ongoing demonstrations, and highlights the need for support from other jurisdictions and levels of government. Ottawa police also announced on Sunday that they would be arresting anyone who assisted the truckers by bringing them gasoline, food, and other resources. We're really focused and targeted on removing the access to gasoline to the area, and we've had several seizures and several arrests related to that, the police statement read. Now, we're going to get into this in a little bit, but I'm not even sure how legal this is, the seizing of the fuel and stuff like that. And it certainly seems like there's a couple of Canadian lawyers that are pretty darn sure that this isn't allowed, as well as the JCCF. So again, this is definitely a dynamic situation. I can't help but feel that this is really just the politicians, the administration, trying to force the truckers into a reaction. And, you know, up until the moment of this shooting, the truckers have been nothing but peaceful and pleasant overall. And again, it's really great to see. I find a lot of warmth and solace in it. Moving on, come on now, this browser doesn't seem to want to load. So essentially, what this article was supposed to show you guys was Freedom Convoy, 6 major developments in the conflict. And again, it was just kind of a useful breakdown of some of the major talking points that were going on. But we're going to keep rolling here. So the next article I wanted to share is from Post Millennial. And this is Send in the Clowns, Ministers Cover for Prime Minister and Hiding Justin Trudeau. And it really is wild to see Justin Trudeau just continuously brush this off, right? We'll see him tweeting out about the Olympics or about his daughter becoming a teenager and things of that nature. But as far as actually coming out and talking about the trucker protest, and this is so much bigger than what he originally painted it as. And again, maybe he was just misinformed. Maybe he just wanted to be misinformed. But at this point in time, over a week in, we're like 10 days deep now since last Friday, for him to essentially still just be missing in the public eye right now, when arguably Canada needs him the most, when arguably what we should be having is a cool and collected leader coming to the table to actually have a discussion, to hear out the truckers, to try and see if there's some sort of solution here that can appease all sides, presenting his perspective, right? Again, right now, he just seems to refuse to even come to the table. Honestly, you know, I've heard Jordan Peterson referred to him as a teenager. This definitely feels like a sulky teenager that's just locked himself in his room and refuses to come out until everyone else agrees to his reality. From the Post Millennial here, federal ministers Bill Blair, Dominic LeBlanc, and Mona Fortier and Mark Mendocino and Omar Algebra took questions on Monday to provide Canadians with an update on the federal response to the Freedom Convoy. One notable absentee, however, was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, whose itinerary states he is in private meetings. Now, these must be some hell of important private meetings, in my opinion, because he essentially was off sick all of last week because he tested positive for COVID, even though he'd been tested a couple times before that and wasn't positive. But I don't know. At this point in time, I'm shocked that the mainstream media still wants to carry water for Justin Trudeau, that they're still comfortable just following his narrative, hook, line, and sinker. It just seems wild. But moving on, want to highlight this from the Globe and Mail. And so this is actually an opinion piece written by Mark Carney. You guys might remember him as, you know, he was the Bank of Canada head, then the Bank of England head. Now he's back in Canada. It's time to end the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa by enforcing the law and following the money. And while I encourage you to read the entire article, I just wanted to hit upon these last 3 paragraphs here, because it's really interesting how Carney here is just focused on really painting the protesters as villains, in my opinion. But again, you guys let me know what your thoughts are. Drawing the line means choking off the money that financed this occupation. Again, many Canadians who were amongst the initial donors were likely well-meaning. Perhaps they were unaware of the convoy's stated objectives. Or, like many in positions of authority in Ottawa, they didn't take them seriously. Perhaps all they wanted was a new COVID-19 policy with fewer restrictions. Now, one, I feel like the trucker convoy has been pretty clear that they're anti-mandates and they just want all mandates gone. So this idea that like, oh, probably a lot of Canadians supported them at first because they just wanted a lighter version of mandates feels like BS to me. And, you know, to argue that the reason they might have financed them at the start was because they weren't taking them seriously, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Second paragraph here. But by now, anyone sending money to the convoy should be in no doubt. You are funding sedition. Foreign funders of an insurrection interfered in our domestic affairs from the start. Canadian authorities should take every step within the law to identify and thoroughly punish them. The involvement of foreign governments and any officials connected to them should be identified, exposed, and addressed. And so this year sounds like he's really bought into the Russian narrative as well. And while, again, for all I know, there could be Russian donors, even the Russian state could have, in theory, donated to this cause. To all of a sudden, like, make that the focus here, I think really just, again, shows a lack of understanding about what's going on in our country. And it is wildly frustrating from my perspective. And I don't know how they can continue to push out this narrative and hope that people will just buy it. But understand that the way Carney's framing this is if you now decide to donate, you're actively supporting sedition. What sedition is that? A bunch of truckers park their vehicles in a block party to protest what's going on in Canada. It's the most Canadian protest I could imagine. And to make this sound like sedition, to make it sound like an occupation when they're referring this to the red zone, like this is all so disingenuous here. And it's just wild to think about how comfortable the mainstream media and their puppets are and just pushing this shit out on us. Third paragraph, I know from experience that crises don't end by themselves. You can't spin your way out of failure. You must recognize the scale of the challenge, devise a clear plan, and then implement it methodically and deliberately. Your determination to do so can never be in doubt. Then and only then can order be restored. In this case, that means enforcing the law and following the money. Individuals must be held responsible for their lawlessness, and those who finance their actions must be dissuaded from ever doing so again. Now, this is something I really want to hit upon here. We're going to cover it lightly in another article, but you know, we talked about it briefly on Friday. GoFundMe essentially, canceled the protest fundraiser. They essentially, held up $9 million. So $1 million originally was released to the organizers to disperse amongst the truckers and to support the protest. And then essentially what happened with GoFundMe was they initially announced that anyone that wanted a refund could request by, I think it was February 19th. And if you didn't, they were going to donate it to another charity that they were going to work out with the original organizers. One, how they thought that was a good idea to me just seems like a PR nightmare. If you're going to cancel it, so be it, but you should immediately refund the money. That's what they've usually done in the past whenever they've canceled a fundraiser that they decided they disagreed with. And again, it feels disingenuous for them to point to, threats and security issues and this being an occupation in regards to why they chose to shut this down. But one thing I want to really highlight here, even for those of you that maybe like completely disagree with the truckers, maybe you're the most pro-mandate person, govern me harder, daddy is your slogan. Even if you do find yourself in that camp, understand that this new precedent that's being set here, that essentially any protest the government doesn't like, any fundraiser the government doesn't like, is immediately sedition. You're immediately a domestic terrorist. And we know that language is coming, right? I think that they're just waiting, hoping that someone will do something crazy so that they can then have the smoking gun to justify their actions. And they'll use this retrospectively as well. But understand that this will be used against other protesters as well. It's not only ever going to be used against people on the right. And again, I don't think that this is a left and right thing. I really look at this as like a statist and an individual perspective at this point in time. I don't think left and right does it justice. And we're even seeing that when we look at some of the surveys we've talked about in the past, where, it's essentially PPC supporters and then Green Party supporters that most support what's going on with these trucker protests. And that's about as right and left as you can get there in regards to the extremes. what we're looking at is this precedent is going to be set, and this will be used against future protesters. Again, whether you're protesting against, if you're anti-mandates, whether you're protesting against certain government policies or oil pipelines and things of that nature, all these rules and precedents will absolutely be used against everyone in the future. This idea that, when it's my side, I want to protect them, and when it's someone else's side, I want to tear them down. That's not how government actually works. The government just views it through the lens of, are you with the state or are you against the state? And it's very clear the government's decided that these protesters are against the state. Continuing on, talking about some of the tactics the truckers have used up until this point. And again, I've been wildly impressed with the methodicalness, the logistics that they've been focused on implementing. I want to highlight here this thread from Twitter. And again, link in the video description down below. This was originally from Hillary White. So a few thoughts. One, the people organizing this quite clearly have experience and serious training in logistics. You don't get a result like this by just a couple of guys jumping in their cabs and taking off one night. They have let it be known they intend to stay. And I really encourage you guys to read this entire thread, but I'm just going to highlight a few points here. We saw rolling down the Trans-Canada with trailers weren't running empty. They were packed with supplies. 3, they are incredibly disciplined on messaging in a way and with a level of intelligence I've never seen in any demonstration organizers before. They knew. Again, I 100% agree here. They seem far more organized, far more articulate, and just really focused not just on like having a protest, but implementing literally the supply chain, the logistics necessary to see this through, regardless of how long Justin Trudeau plans on playing hide and seek. Continuing on, with precision detail what to expect from the provincial, federal, and municipal government. They knew what to expect in detail from both media and agitators, counter-protesters, and people planted in the crowd to cause trouble, and have a well-coordinated and clearly communicated and strictly enforced protocol. And again, this is really important to understand, and I think that they've really set a new precedent or high watermark in regards to how protests should be organized, because despite the media just wanting to paint them in a negative light, it's been so difficult. We've seen the mental gymnastics, the bending over backwards in order to try and find some semblance of a justification for why these protesters are bad. And for the most part, mainstream media, despite their best efforts, continues to come up short in that regards. And this is important to understand because, again, had there been real violence, had there been news right during these this first 10 days of the protest, the mainstream media, the administration, the police, maybe even the army at this point in time would have all been on top of it. But so far, the protesters literally have given no excuse to the administration on why they should come with a heavy-fisted hand towards this protest. And again, just thinking about even how they came into Ottawa, right? My understanding is that they had, I'm going to forget the name here, but essentially they had different like group leaders, right? That were coordinating not only amongst themselves, but also continuously talking with law enforcement to let, province by province, region by region, city by city know like, hey, we're coming through. This is our intentions. In addition to that, they've worked really hard at making sure that like they're not blocking emergency vehicles and all those different angles that might have been able to paint them in a negative light. It seems like they always were one step ahead at this point in time. And it's hard not to feel like the truckers are playing 4D chess while, Justin Trudeau's just flipping the checkers board. Continuing on, point number 5 here. They have blocked the center of the city of Ottawa, but it hasn't been random. They've done it in close coordination with the Ottawa City Police to ensure that there is 1, space for emergency first responder vehicles to continue to operate, 2, allowing space for very large groups of people on foot to continue to gather and meet and talk and walk together. Again, yeah, I'm wildly blown away. I really think that we'll see people studying this in the future. Number 9, all this tells me that 1, this has been meticulously planned by professional trained experts in logistics, but the kind of training you pretty much can't get from the private sector. The people doing this are ex-military, and 2, they've got a bigger plan than just to park a bunch of trucks along Wellington Street and honk honk and have a street party for a weekend. They brought enough supplies to be there for weeks. They've set up canteens and services in the streets that have been blocked off. These are people who really know what they're doing. And I 100% agree with that. And again, it seems like they've really tapped their their different members for all their specialties, right? We've heard about ex-police and ex-military that are helping coordinate and advise on what's going on here. We've also heard about just some of the rules and regulations that they've rolled out amongst themselves, right, in order to make sure that essentially it's very difficult for the mainstream media to paint them in a negative light. And again, really long thread here. I encourage you guys to check it out. But another thread I want to share with you, this is from Ian Runkle. And so what he's talking about here is a little bit more how modern day policing normally shuts down protests, and how up until this point in time, the Freedom Convoy has really frustrated the police by not giving them the excuse, by not playing into their typical tactics. So the other thing is that people are wondering why this protest hasn't been wrapped up by police. A thread. Modern police protest busting relies very heavily on using extreme force while having the illusion of using very little force. And this is something that when you look towards, like, some of the protests, particularly in Belgium and the Netherlands and a few of those other Central European or Northern European countries, you can really see it playing out there where the police use very heavy-handed tactics, but because some of the protesters are engaging with them, their media is able to spin it to make it seem like it was always justified. This is because when police are seen as using heavy-handed tactics to disrupt a protest, it gives a protest legitimacy, which police don't want. Using live ammunition or the like is going to drive incredible anger and can cause a protest for anything to spiral out of control. It should be noted that police forces have gotten very good at this through a variety of tactics. Fatalities are rare, and injuries, deaths can be spun off as tragic consequences of the failures of less lethal munitions rather than intentional atrocities. So dogs and live ammo are out, chemical agents and rubber bullets are in. I mean, tear gas is horrible, but from an optics perspective, it's great. Barely looks like you're doing anything, and your opposition turns into blubbery, pathetic messes. Win for the police. Again, I really encourage you guys to read this entire thread, but I think when you think about how the trucker freedom themselves, one, it's been a very unaggressive approach, right? And I think that at first allowed them to get the benefit of the doubt from the Ottawa police services, which we've obviously seen have really pivoted in their stance. Go back and look at their tweets from like 10 days ago versus the tweets they were putting out this weekend, and it either seems like they're a little bipolar, or they've literally put someone else in charge of their tweets, because the rhetoric coming out of them is so much more aggressive than anything we heard the first weekend. And again, I'm sure that person tweeting it out, they're just being told by higher ups in order to paint a certain picture or narrative. But, the idea of having these bouncy castles, of, cleaning sidewalks, of making sure waste is taken care of making sure that no one is aggressive or violent during the protest, all this makes it very difficult for the police to use their usual tactics in order to break up the protests we're seeing in Ottawa. Continuing on, what I want to highlight here is from the Toronto Star. Here's how Canada's Freedom Convoy is being described by media around the world. And now they certainly cherry pick a lot of these headlines here, and it's very obvious the narrative they're trying to paint. But even that, I don't think shows the smoking gun that likely the Toronto Star was hoping they were going to get from this article. Politico, Canada, far-right capital of the world. This is the most asinine thing I could imagine. We're the far-right capital of the world. Next one, the Hindustan Times, karma strikes back. Canada truckers protest continue. Indian Twitter mocks Justin Trudeau. So if you guys haven't seen, one of the former Commonwealth countries, India, has definitely been taking shots at the Canadian government and the Canadian regime in regards to how they're handling this. And I can't blame them. France 24 English. Did The Simpsons predict Canadian truckers' freedom convoy? So this is just kind of a misunderstanding. And again, it's weird that that's a headline that you'd want to feature in this. Russian Times, media floats Russia theory for Canadian trucker protests. And now, if you were to look at some other Russian Times headlines, you'll find much more aggressive headlines and articles than what this one's portraying. But they were able to cherry pick one that doesn't necessarily really showcase how the Russian Times would usually be portraying this. The Sydney Morning Herald, Ottawa mayor declares state of emergency amid paralyzing anti-mandate protests. And this is something I want to highlight here, because it's important to understand this is anti-mandate protests, right? I see so often in the Canadian press where they're anti-vaxxer protests, right? When it's like anti-government protests, it's important to understand they're anti-government mandates. And at this point in time, you think that the the Canadian mainstream press would have had the opportunity to get their shit together and understand that that's what it is, because again, the Convoy has actually released essentially their white paper or their article stating what their goals are. Fox News GoFundMe now nixing Canadian trucker fundraiser, promoted Capitol Hill occupied protest appeal. And then finally, the New York Times, Ottawa residents fed up with truckers, noisy and intimidating occupation. And it's fascinating to hear the language and the rhetoric coming out from all these different mainstream sources. Now from the Toronto Sun, Trump backers seize on GoFundMe controversy as truckers linger in U.S. headlines. So it's really interesting to hear the narrative that's being painted by the Canadian press, that essentially, like, now that Trump endorsed it, that's the most important aspect of this entire protest. And it's very obvious to me, at least in my biased opinion, that, the Canadian press is like, whoa, people still, like, Canadians still dislike Trump, right? So if we say Orange Man endorsed it, they'll be like, Orange Man bad, so therefore this is bad. Like, that's literally the level of thinking I feel like the mainstream media is putting into this approach. But I just want to highlight a couple points here made in this article that was making the rounds on a lot of different Canadian news sites. The platform became a target over the weekend for prominent Republican lawmakers and state leaders after freezing more than $9 million in donations earmarked for the ongoing protests in Ottawa. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and Texas Senator Ted Cruz were among those who attacked GoFundMe for initially saying it would redistribute the remaining funds to charities chosen by protest organizers. But again, they said that were vetted by GoFundMe. The company reversed course quickly, however, promising automatic refunds to donors just hours after its initial announcement. And again, while that certainly is the better approach, as the automatic refunds, understand will still likely take 7 to 10 days, according to GoFundMe, in order for those that contributed to the fundraiser to get their money back, in which case, if they want to redonate to the Give, Send, Go, or to the Hong Kong Bitcoin fundraiser. There's a couple different fundraisers now raising money for these protests. But again, understand that Mark Carney is writing in the Globe and Mail an article essentially saying at this point in time, if you donate, you're actively supporting sedition in Canada, which is just wild. And then finally want to highlight this. That isn't stopping the right-wing media machine in the U.S., which continues to savage GoFundMe as they devote outsized daily coverage to the Canadian protests. No Canadian media. This isn't outsized attention to the trucker protests. It's just that you guys are downplaying it so much that when you look to the U.S. and you see them actually covering it, you're like, why would they cover something about a fringe minority of Canadians that no one even cares about? No, actually, it appears that there's millions of Canadians now that support this and likely have all along. It's just you won't give them the time of day, or you won't give them the soapbox in order to actually be heard. Another article from the Toronto Sun here. And this was crazy that Del Duca is essentially coming out full-on communist. Sees the trucks of protest in Ottawa. I consider the people of Ottawa victims at this point in time, he said. And we'll just let him say it exactly in his own words, because this is wild, in my opinion. I think that we need to declare a provincial state of emergency. This is how serious the situation is, Del Duca said Monday. Existing provincial legislation, which might make the protest organized liable for mounting police costs, should be used, he said. And the third thing, if I were a premier today, I would be making crystal clear the provincial attorney general would be explaining that prosecutors here in the province of Ontario would use every tool in their toolkit, every tool available, to make sure that a strong message was being sent, including the seizing of the forfeiture of property, including trucks that are used in the commission of a serious crime, Del Duca said. So now literally parking your trucks in the middle of the road is a serious crime that essentially justifies the forfeiture of those trucks, the seizing of them. This is wild to see that play out in real time. And I can't help but wonder, do these politicians, does Del Duca, does Justin Trudeau still think that this somehow ends with them being the good guys? I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions. Are they so self-deluded? Do they exist in an echo chamber? Because they're still acting as if this is a fringe minority of Canadians. Continuing on, Del Duca said anti-vax mob. So again, immediately disparaging them rather than talking about them being anti-vax mandates. He immediately goes to anti-vax mob, is holding Ottawa families and businesses hostage, refusing to leave the capital city despite 11 days of protest. Residents have been verbally abused and many are afraid to walk around their own city, he said. Now, again, we constantly hear about these verbal abuses, about intimidation, and yet when we actually look at cases and charges, it seems very sparse. yet there seems to be a large, heavy presence of police. So are police looking the other way? In which case, that's a policing issue. Or is it that a lot of this is just hearsay and the media just jumps on it the moment they get the opportunity to? Because remember, after the first weekend, as of Monday, after the first weekend, there was literally 0 charges. Later, afterwards, it sounds like a couple charges did come out. But understand that the Ottawa Police originally stated in a press conference there was no charges. Solicitor General spokesperson Stephen Warner replied in an email that more than 1,500 OPP personnel have been deployed to the city since the beginning of the protest. So again, there's actually a heavy police presence there. And this is one of the weird things about some of the incidences that are occurring at these protests is where there appears to be a heavy police presence. People make these claims, and yet no one's actually filing police reports. No, and we're going to get into the arson story in a little bit, and what a strange web that appears to be. Again, obviously, some details are still yet to be determined or confirmed, but it seems really strange, and we'll get to that in a second. But CTV News, Ottawa under siege, officials say as mayor asks for more help. And I just want to highlight here again some of the language they're using, constantly talking about it being insurrection. On Monday, Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson sent letters Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau saying the protests had turned into a siege of our downtown area and asked the provincial and federal governments for an immediate injection of additional officers. I think one of the big questions here is, and while we didn't experience it to the same extent in Canada by any stretch of the imagination, all we need to do is look back, to last summer and the previous summer in the United States and how a lot of Canadian press was positioning those occupations, those sieges, as justified, right, during the Black Lives Matter protests. Injunction granted in class action lawsuit. So one of downtown Ottawa residents' major complaints, the incessant hawking, spurred the filing on Friday of a $9.8 million class action proposed lawsuit on their behalf. And so, what we're starting to see now is the judge has put an injunction where for 10 days, you're not allowed to use an air horn in order to honk. I've seen some protesters saying that they're going to have to break out the cowbell. I guess all I've got to say that is more cowbell. Continuing on, this is from the AP. Ottawa declared state of emergency over COVID-19 protests. So again, just want to highlight how focused the mainstream media is on highlighting this state of emergency. Meanwhile, there was actually an incident in Winnipeg where where 4 people were hit by a vehicle by an Antifa member. And essentially, it seemed like it almost had no coverage outside of local Winnipeg and Manitoba news. NDP calls for emergency debate as Ottawa asks province federal government for 1,800 more officers. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is calling for an emergency debate in the House of Commons as Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson asked the federal and provincial governments for 1,800 more police officers to deal with the anti-vaccine mandate protests tying downtown in knots. In a letter Monday to Commons Speaker Anthony Rota, Singh said he'll ask for a debate on the occupation in Ottawa and the protests that have popped up around the country in support of ending all vaccine mandates. The situation has reached a crisis point. And in times of crisis, it is important for federal leaders to show leadership, to urge de-escalation, and to work together to find solutions, he wrote. Now, one thing that I'm kind of curious about here is, will this actually say there is an emergency vote or debate? Will this draw Justin Trudeau out of his shell, or will he continue just to hide? Because I can't help but think that he's just going to continue to... At this point in time, I think the only thing that's going to get Justin Trudeau out is if there's a major controversy involving the protesters where he can finally point to them being evil, racist, and so on and so forth. Outside of that, I'm very curious to see when he'll step out. And again, maybe he'll surprise me and tomorrow he'll come out and be very nuanced in his approach, and maybe he'll step on some of his language and rhetoric where essentially he was painting anyone that disagrees with him as wrong-headed, to say the least. Again, this is from National News Watch. Judge grants interim injunction against loud honking at Ottawa protests. So link in the video description down below if you guys want to jump into that. Reuters, Canada, court silences protesters, horns, police seize fuel. So this police seizing fuel is a big deal because, again, it appears that they don't necessarily have the strongest footing to act upon it. It's one thing to silence the protesters, right? A judge appears to have properly put an injunction on honking horns for 10 days in the downtown area. From what I've seen from a lot of legal experts on Twitter, it sounds like, yep, hey, don't be using your horns or you will run the risk of getting fined. But what I did want to highlight is how the mainstream news is covering this, and then we're going to cover how some people of different opinions are covering it. Police target fuel supply for Freedom Convoy demonstration in Ottawa. This is from CTV News. Dozens of armed police officers and firefighters moved into a parking lot at the Ottawa baseball stadium on Coventry Road just before 7 p.m. Sunday, seizing 3,200 liters of fuel being stored in the parking lot. They swooped in, it sounds like, quite quickly and took all the propane and all the fuel and left. In a very big show of force, reports CTV News Ottawa chief anchor Graham Richardson. Some of the truckers are quite angry, started yelling at me. They're clearly not happy. So again, I can understand why they'd be angry, why they'd be yelling, particularly when this seems to have just happened on, like within a day's notice, right? Like literally we went from it's freezing cold outside. These truckers need this fuel to keep themselves warm at night. And then all of a sudden the government seizes it on a Sunday, which essentially seems like, again, they're either trying to force a reaction or hoping that all of a sudden, because it's cold, the protesters will just give up. Now, there's been lots of photos and videos circling on Twitter showing people. It seems like there's more jerry cans now in Ottawa downtown than there was before this action. So I think that, like most of the action that the administration, police, and government officials have done up until this point, it actually is just drawing more support and more of a commitment from the protesters. This is from the Justice Center. So this is in regards to what the Ottawa police are doing. So again, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Ottawa police decree is illegal, Justice Center warns. Why does that do that? 1 second. So Ottawa, the Justice Center today warned that Ottawa police would be breaking the law if police attempt to intimidate or arrest people who bring food or other supplies to truckers who are peacefully exercising their charter rights and freedoms in Ottawa. A tweet from Ottawa police from 11:52 a.m. on Sunday, February 6th, states anyone attempting to bring material support, gas, etc. to the demonstrations could be subject to arrest. Enforcement is underway. Again, what does etc. mean? Like literally bring them any materials. If you brought them a blanket, if you brought them food, seems wild to think that we're at this moment in time. People who bring food, water, gasoline, or other supplies to peacefully protest truckers are not breaking any law. There is no basis for this police threat that was issued by Twitter this morning, states lawyer Nicholas Wansbutter, retained by the Justice Center, which is representing the Freedom Convoy. In a free and democratic society that is governed by the rule of law, citizens can freely associate with each other, including the giving and receiving of goods and gifts. There is no law that would allow the Ottawa police to arrest people for giving fuel or food to another Canadian, continues Mr. Wansbutter. And at the bottom here, the truckers themselves are exercising their charter freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly as they are legally entitled to do, concludes Mr. Wansbutter. So again, link in the video description down below. And I saw David Anber here, who's a criminal lawyer. He was also sharing his 2 cents. So for anyone that maybe finds themselves in a sticky situation with the police while you're trying to bring in supplies, what to do about seized jerry cans and arrests. I've been getting a lot of DMs about this. Please do the following. When an officer tells you to give your property to him, say, no, I refuse to give you my property, or give me back my property. Do not yell or be aggressive. 2, if he refuses, ask him to tell you the reason why. Try to document it in personal notes or on audio or video. Ask for his name and badge number. Also try and capture video of him or her. It is probable that these seizures are not lawful, but it's never clear-cut in court. Update. I've started to receive calls from people arrested. It appears that the allegation is aiding and abetting mischief. There's some basis for this to be alleged, although it may not hold up in court. At this stage, it is criminal that you don't say anything, or it's crucial, sorry. At this stage, it is crucial that you don't say anything to police other than your name and address. Your name and address. The comments I mentioned above, note that this is not legal advice since it cannot apply to every possible fact pattern, but it's genuinely sound information given what we know. So again, important that that you guys, that we, that the protesters all stay up to date on what's going on, because this is such a dynamic situation. And then just wanted to highlight here from Rebel News, Quebec City Freedom Convoy protest organizers fundraiser canceled by crowdfunding platform. So this is a different fundraiser and a different platform, but Simply K CEO Francois de Carrot claims the fundraiser was terminated because the campaign violated the conditions of the platform's terms and services. So right now, obviously, I'm primarily focusing on what's going on in Ottawa, but I understand there was protests, from coast to coast in Canada. Again, we haven't even really got into what's going on in New Brunswick and some of their draconian rules and regulations they've been trying to implement. Another article from Rebel News, breaking, police began arresting convoy protesters outside Parliament. The Ottawa police began arresting protesters shortly after the city declared a state of emergency following the ongoing Freedom Convoy occupation of Parliament Hill. And it's important you guys get well informed on this stuff, because I see so much misinformation on Twitter, particularly from blue check marks. So link in the video description down below. But one of the things that really stands out to me is the constant narrative of, for the last 10 days, my life has been hell living in downtown Ottawa. Now, let me make the assumption that they're telling the absolute truth and that it is a living hell. One, I'm sorry to hear that. But two, understand, for a lot of Canadians, the last 2 years have been living hell, right? Their kids have had to go to school masked, right? They've had virtual learning at almost every turn. We're essentially sacrificing an entire generation of children in the hopes of getting a tiny bit more safety, even though, as we've covered in last week on multiple occasions, there was that Johns Hopkins University study that came out that essentially stated that lockdowns, that all the mandates that the governments across the world have implemented up until this point in time seem to have had a negligible or no effect whatsoever. And while Dr. Anthony Fauci will say that millions of lives have been saved, that study seems to point to other interpretations of what Dr. Fauci's saying. So again, it's so frustrating at this point in time to see the mainstream media only focus on one piece of the narrative. And in fact, it seems like the Freedom Convoy is almost hijacked the entire discussion around that Johns Hopkins metadata study. Again, if you guys want to check that out, go back to, I believe, Wednesday or Thursday's videos where we talked about it multiple times, because I thought it was so important. I didn't want it to get lost in the news cycle. Now from the Western Standard, trucker convoy hits Ambassador Bridge in Windsor. So again, we're starting to see more protests and more blockades or more disruptions to transportation routes popping up all over. One of the newest ones seems to be in Windsor, Ontario. And understand that this is a major border crossing, right? Now, the one in Coutts, Alberta was also major. It was the only 24-hour border crossing in Alberta, but a lot of traffic goes between Windsor. And so again, link in the video description down below if you guys want to get more familiarized with that. I want to share this from the Ron Paul Institute. So GoFundMe and the Nag's Head Light, how crowdfunding has become the latest battleground over free speech. And this is a great article. It goes into a little bit of history as well that I encourage you guys to check out, but I just wanted to highlight the first paragraph. GoFundMe's suspension of millions to support protesting truckers in Canada shocked many, particularly when the company initially announced its intention to distribute the money to other charities. It was less of a surprise for those of us who have criticized the company for years over its use of the platform to target and block funds for conservative and libertarian causes. Indeed, the company has revised an old practice known as the Nag's Head Light in luring the unsuspecting into what has become a liberal lockbox on funds. And this is important to understand, and we don't have a chance to get into the Nag's Head example, but again, it's broken down for you in this article. But I just wanted to highlight or remind you guys of some of the other biases GoFundMe has shown up until this point in time. So GoFundMe froze donations needed to support Kyle Rittenhouse's legal defense because he was accused of a violent crime. However, that is the point of a trial. He was accused of a crime and he was entitled to a presumption of innocence. However, the media ran false accounts of the story, while social media companies like TikTok censored pro-Rittenhouse material. One police officer was fired for simply donating to Rittenhouse anonymously on GoFundMe. Neither the company nor the media came to the defense of Norfolk police officer William Kelly. Rittenhouse was, of course, acquitted. Then GoFundMe released the funds after they were no longer needed to support his trial. The company also suspended litigation funds for accused police officers as well as parents who sought to challenge vaccine mandates in court. And this is important to understand. I think we all actually want to live in a society where there's the presumption of innocence, right? That's the reason we have a trial. And yet what we're seeing now develop here in Canada, and there's lots of examples outside of Canada as well, is essentially a trial of court or like of public opinion rather than occurring in a court of law. And so literally, again, what charges have been laid against the organizers of this protest? Even what charges in general have been laid against participants of this protest that justify literally locking out these funds? It is wild to see this happening in real time, and understand that any democracy, any free society that wants to actually maintain that won't maintain it for long if we continue to see these draconian rules and just this petty tyranny infest every aspect of our society. we just want to highlight this article from Spencer Fernando. Encourage you guys to go check it out. But the Freedom Convoy is more popular than the Liberal Party. Essentially, he refers to a couple recent polls that have been done where it shows 32% support for the trucker Freedom Convoy, whereas the Liberals, their vote, that actually averaged out to 30%. So technically, this fringe minority of truckers actually has more support than the Liberal Party itself. But again, I encourage you guys, go read the entire article and just get familiarized with it. But it's important to understand that there's consequences to how the mainstream media tries to frame these narratives. And those consequences impact the ability for individuals to fundraise, for individuals to call out the hypocrisy that the government's enacting, right? We need checks and balances in a society. And free press is supposed to be one of those checks, but instead it's simply become the propaganda wing of the government. And now let's move on to the event that happened in Winnipeg, where someone was struck by a Jeep. 4 individuals were struck. 1 went to hospital and then was later released. I'll let you guys watch the actual original press release yourself. Again, link in the video description down below. But just wanted to highlight the way different media outlets are bringing this to attention. So CBC News, Winnipeg police ID driver accused in hit and run involving protesters against pandemic restrictions. So David Alexander Zagarik, 42, of Headingley, Manitoba, has been charged with a number of offenses, including 4 counts of assault with a weapon, failing to stop at the scene of an accident, and dangerous operation of a vehicle causing bodily harm. Now, this isn't a perfect analogy, and I know some people are going to get immediately triggered if I even bring it up, but understand that right now, at this moment in time, it appears that there's more evidence that this was an intentional act than, say, that act of terrorism that occurred in London where a Muslim family was killed in a hit and run. Now, again, it very well may be that in that London case that's 100% what happened, but very little information has been released. Almost none's been released to the public in order for us to actually understand why it was immediately treated as a terrorist attack. Whereas this here, which this individual is actually a member of Antifa, he's spoken out multiple times. It sounds like he even had some words at the time of his arrest, and yet none of this is being painted as if it was particularly targeting a group of people. On Saturday, Carver said he couldn't speak to the driver's motivations. This is the police department now. Couldn't speak to the driver's motivations for allegedly striking the protesters, but said the driver had blurted out statements that made police think it wasn't about pandemic-related mandates. Very hard for me to want to give him the benefit of the doubt, but again, we do want to live in that free society where people are given it, but it's interesting how the narrative gets spun depending upon what I think the propaganda wing thinks the politicians want to hear. From Rebel News, hit and run injures protesters at Winnipeg Freedom Rally. And so I just want to highlight, if you were trying to do justice to even what occurred here, Rebel News here did a much better job of summarizing, where it's like bullet points and we actually see all the charges, where CBC just kind of rambled on about it. The 42-year-old driver was detained in custody and faces the following charges: assault with a weapon ×4, dangerous operation of vehicle causing bodily harm ×2, dangerous operation of a vehicle, failure to stop after accident ×2, failure to stop at the scene of an accident ×2. And then this from Post Millennial report: suspect charged in Winnipeg attack on convoy protest revealed to be Antifa radical. So despite Zagarik's online presence, Winnipeg police claim they were not able to address the motivations of Zagarik's alleged attacks on the protesters. Dave Zagarik, the man charged in Winnipeg for an attack on the convoy protest, has been revealed as a far-left radical anarchist by Rebel News, yet local authorities are classifying the incident as a hit and run rather than a hate crime. And again, I just think it's important to highlight this because I think that under different circumstances, the press would immediately jump to conclusions. Now, in a perfect world, the press would just never jump to conclusions, and they would just literally leave the facts until the police make charges and roll out their logic for it, and we eventually see trials and things of that nature. But it is important to understand that there's very different narratives being painted depending upon which side of the partisanship you are. And like I said, I know a lot of people want to boil this down to left and right, but to me, it really is statists and individualists that are having these discussions. Andy No was also sharing on his locals essentially some breakdowns in some of the posts from the perpetrator of the hit and run. So the suspect arrested over the car ramming attack against the Freedom Convoy protesters in Winnipeg, Canada, is an Antifa member with a long history of far-left militantism in Manitoba. David Alexander Zagarik, 42, of Headingley, Manitoba, allegedly sped off to try and escape after the attack on February 4th, 2022, which injured 4 people. He ran multiple lights and resisted arrest when he was finally caught around 40 minutes later. He was the frontman for an Antifa punk band, Brad Attack, until the record label dropped the group because of multiple accusations of sexual assault against Zagarik in 2015. One of the accusers said she was only 13 when he raped her and raped her. So again, certainly doesn't seem like a good person by any stretch of the imagination. Going on, post-millennial, journalists urged running over Nazis days before Freedom Convoy protesters were mowed down in Winnipeg. And this is a direct quote from the tweet. "If you see Nazis on the side of the road, do the responsible thing and run them over," the reporter wrote. Just days before our 4 Freedom Convoy supporters were hit by a car in Winnipeg, Canada, a Twitter-verified journalist encouraged people to run over Nazis. Writer and producer Brian Walton wrote to Twitter followers on January 31st, "If you see Nazis on the side of the road, do the responsible thing and run them over." And now, if you guys go throughout the article, later on, he claimed that this had to do with Nazis that were spotted on the side of the road in Orlando, Florida. But what's also really interesting is just how he doubled down on this call for violence against people essentially for their beliefs. And while, again, we may find those beliefs abhorrent, we may find them distasteful, we may think that they're terrible people for having those beliefs, I think we still want to live in a society where we don't just immediately say you should be able to enact violence or kill or delete these people. So this is a direct quote from him in response to all this. "I'm so over people projecting their bullshit onto me. Do I think swastika waving Nazis should die? 100%. If you're calling for the genocide of minorities, I 100% think the world is better without you. I do not give a shit about protesters in Canada. I really don't." But again, understand that essentially by his own logic here is that if one of those protesters did wave a Nazi flag, which, you know, depending on your opinion, there was someone with a Nazi flag at the Ottawa protest last weekend. Maybe it was a false flag. Maybe it was someone trying to hijack the narrative. Maybe it was a supporter of it. It still is pretty blatant what he's calling here for. And I think that if you were to put this on the other foot, right, when we talk about communist regimes, Joseph Stalin and things of that nature, which have caused arguably as many or more deaths than Nazi ideology, again, it's important to understand that there's impacts to these words, right? And when we're seeing this from a verified journalist, again, I think it calls into question their impartiality towards these sort of things. But continuing on, I want to highlight now this really weird situation. And while I've kind of got my own biases towards what went on with this arson case in Ottawa, I just want to highlight overall what went down. And you guys can, you know, do a deep dive, link in the video description down below to all these resources, but really strange situation. So this came out originally on a Twitter thread, and this came out like a day after the fact, or well, half a day after the fact, right? Over 12 hours afterwards. "I've been hesitating to post this publicly, but I feel I must for the safety downtown Ottawa residents. Here are the facts. Last night, 2 arsonists brought a full package of fire starter bricks into a building's lobby at 5 a.m. The building is located at Metcalf and Lisgar. And so I'm not going to read all the posts, but I encourage you guys really go and read them all and try and make your own conclusions here. But there's a wild amount of weird situations. So one, these people went into this building with apparently the desire to start a fire. They literally did start a fire, but one of the residents walked in on them while they were starting the fire, asked them what they were doing, and the person said, "We're trucker protesters." And then that person went up to their apartment. They didn't call the police. They didn't call the firefighters. They didn't even leave the building, which apparently was being tried to be started on fire. They just went to bed, which is just bizarre. Again, who knows the exact circumstances of this? I'm sure hopefully more information will come to light. But this wasn't reported to the police until 2 p.m. the next day. So literally almost 12 hours later is when it finally was reported. As well, it appears that like this video footage of the individuals responsible for trying to start the fire was released on Twitter before the police even had it, which again just seems bizarre. Also, it looks like these individuals did try and like shut the doors by taping them up so that people couldn't escape, which like I guess I should preface before I even went down this rabbit hole. whoever's responsible for trying to set this building on fire, they're a piece of shit, and they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Doesn't matter whether they're a trucker or an anti-trucker protester, but the circumstances just seem strange. And a couple other little things I'll just point out is like, it's weird that one of them actually had a mask on or like a mask dangling from his face. If anything, I would have guessed that trucker protesters wouldn't have a ton of masks. But again, that's not really that substantial to this overall discussion. Ottawa police did put this out, essentially looking for these two suspects. So if you guys do know these individuals, please do get in contact with the police and report them because they absolutely are pieces of shit that were trying to cause harm. I did see some people on Twitter pointing out, interesting that this person appears to have purple hair. Again, not the first thing I'd assume a trucker would have, but again, if it is truckers, they deserve to be punished the same way if they're not truckers. But it really does seem strange that a resident walked in on them and didn't report it immediately. Like, again, if I walk in on someone, they're trying to burn down my house, I'm going to speak out. Then this was making the rounds on Twitter. I spoke to Mattias, he was the one that originally posted this on Twitter last night. He came down when I walked over here to check things out. My hotel is just 300 meters away. Mattias is lying. There are no protesters anywhere near here, not a single truck in sight, and there were no horns blaring until 4 a.m. So again, this is one person's opinion on what's going on. Link in the video description down below if you guys want to check it out further. And then Jonathan K also tweeted this. So the story here is that last night there was a mass murder plot in an Ottawa apartment building with one of the would-be killers telling a passerby for no apparent reason he was a protester. But no one calls 911, and Ottawa's arson unit finds out about it on Twitter a day later. Again, it seems very strange. Eventually this was picked up in the mainstream media. So this is from National News Watch. Police arson unit probes Ottawa fire allegation in heat of anti-mandate protests. So Ottawa police are investigating what appears to be an attempt to start a fire in the lobby of a downtown Ottawa apartment building where tenants say they have been besieged by anti-vaccine mandate protesters raging in the national capital for more than a week. Now, raging, again, language is important here, and I think that this does a disservice to the peaceful protesters. Matthias Munoz said that when he came downstairs Sunday morning, he saw the carpet and floor were charred and that there were blackened fire starter bricks strewn about the lobby. The building manager showed him surveillance video, which he said appears to show two men light a package of the bricks in the lobby and secure the front door handles together before leaving through the side door around 5 a.m. Sunday. The video also shows a different man enter the building and put the fire out. A short while later, he said in an interview, again, it's just strange that no one reported this immediately to the police. Now, later on in the article, they're interviewing some of the residents of the building, and they essentially say that this just speaks to the general lawlessness that's occurring during these protests. But if you guys didn't know, actually, this came out from Blacklock's reporter. This one's courtesy of Post Millennial, but street crime falls in downtown Ottawa since start of Freedom Convoy protests. So despite claims from media and politicians, the Freedom Convoy in downtown Ottawa has actually resulted in a fall of street crime. And again, link to the entire Blacklock's article. I encourage you guys to go read it, but I just want to highlight a segment of it here. The truckers' blockade covers 10 square blocks in the center town district. Preliminary police data shows street crime fell sharply in the district since the protest began last Friday. The district saw 31 police calls for robbery, assault, drug trafficking, public drunkenness, stolen vehicles, store break-ins, and other crimes in the week prior to the protest. There were 3 reports of street crime since the protest began for mischief, robbery, and auto theft. Police yesterday said data were incomplete. So again, this isn't perfect, but it doesn't seem like it's a crazy state of lawlessness that's occurring in Ottawa, particularly if we're seeing police stats drop that dramatically. Now, moving on, this is from a mainstream media source here. So this is the CBC's expert on anti-hate, who was actually found out to be spreading misinformation about what's going on at these protests. And well, again, I understand we all pick up on random Twitter threads, and sometimes we retweet things without checking all their sources. Honestly, how isn't it that the mainstream media doesn't just do reverse image searches at this point in time when they're trying to fact check things? How isn't it that we don't hold these experts that are funded by the government to a higher standard than we would some random anon on Twitter? Chair of Trudeau-funded anti-hate network spreads anti-Semitism hoax to smear Canadian truckers. So in an apparent effort to smear truckers, chair of the anti-hate network, Bernie Farber, has spread disinformation on social media regarding the ongoing Freedom Convoy. And so essentially what they said was being passed out was a flyer that was actually passed out in Miami. And literally it's the exact same photo that was used to say that it was being passed out in Canada. However, it appears the image is identical to the photo posted on Twitter 2 weeks ago by someone in Miami, Florida, as pointed out by Jonathan K., who said, "Wow, Bernie, isn't it incredible that the picture your friend in Ottawa at the occupation sent you is identical to the photo posted on Twitter 2 weeks ago by someone in Miami, right down to the ceramic design in the background." And it does seem pretty damning overall when you look at these two photos. Again, link in the video description down below if you guys want to do your own research. Despite the flyer being a hoax, Farber's tweet was retweeted by numerous politicians and journalists. Angie Seth of CTV said, "This is both disgusting and horrifying," in reaction to the fake photo. "This is sick," said Kyle Haritha, Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Parliamentary Affairs of Canada's Minister of Natural Resources. So again, I'm sure we've all been caught up in these in the past, but I think that mainstream media should at least be able to do some basic fact checking on this. And Andy No also tweeted out about it and shared his thoughts and his perspective. We actually covered this CBC expert on a previous video last week, where I was highlighting how crazy it seems that he's claiming that this protest convoy had the worst display of Nazi propaganda in the country, which is just asinine, right? Like, there's been actual Nazi rallies in Canada in the past. So to think that the trucker protest somehow was the worst display of it just is mind-boggling, in my opinion. And then again, link to Andy's tweets if you guys want to check out the original sources here. And then I want to highlight this as well because Brian Lilly actually explains what's going on. But there was this one individual in Toronto who had a anti-Semitic poster that he was holding up and speaking, anti-Semitic views. And essentially immediately a lot of the mainstream media and a lot of blue check marks on Twitter started highlighting this as a sign of how the truckers are racist. Well, Brian Lilly actually breaks down what the real situation was. Liberal MPs like Chris Biddle want to brand the whole Toronto protest with this man. I ran into him just before 6 p.m. with protest supporters and opponents. Both sides told him he was wrong and should leave. The exchange was fascinating. Then someone stole his sign and destroyed it. The two men to the left who supported the protest said they were Jewish and asked the man if he knew how wrong he was. They also tried to ask why he was putting the message out there and if he understood how racist it was. The woman to my right opposed the protest and this man. She was also pleased to see everyone around this man telling him how wrong he was. I honestly can't tell you if this man is just a racist, a complete idiot, or a plant. He had trouble explaining why he was there and what he believed. He just kept pushing the website. After his sign was stolen and destroyed, he slithered away. What was good was seeing all sides denounce his racist message. Yep. So again, a lot of mainstream media and blue check marks were positioning this as a sign of how racist the truckers were, when very clearly he wasn't actually part of the main protest, nor was he part of the counter protest. He was just a man alone spewing his hatred and anti-Semitic views. And then finally, I did want to leave you guys on a slightly happier or funnier note because we do like to share memes at the end of the day. And so not sure if you guys play around in the crypto world, but this is already a very popular meme. But are you winning, son? It's Fidel Castro. Trudeau's hiding under his bed, and there's a truck honking outside. I'll leave you guys to go down your own rabbit holes if you want to figure out why people think that makes sense. But yeah. That's it for today's video. I know we went a little long. I hope you guys enjoyed it and got value from it. Smash the like button if you did. If you're currently participating in the protest, I'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, your perspective. Or if you're an Ottawa resident that's extremely frustrated, again, I'd love to hear your perspective and jump in that comment section and let me know what your take is on everything going on here. Again, I'm definitely a little biased on all this, but at least I try and make my biases obvious on the outset. Let's quickly jump into the chat and appreciate everyone that engages with these videos. So Aislinn says first, Jessica Lynn says, super great atmosphere. I stopped by Coventry just today to donate Spirits Still Up. That's great to hear. Kyle O'Connor says second. Awesome Swell says, good afternoon, Matt. Hey, awesome. Rando's giving me praise. Appreciate it. We've got Blaine Stewart here. I would like our protest to be referred to as a rally as we are peaceful. Protester sounds criminal. Laugh out loud. Go Canada proud and free. Stay strong and be safe out there. Absolutely. And again, language does matter. And I probably should try and do a better job of saying rally, Blaine, because it has been very peaceful. But I do think protest is a reasonable descriptor for it. However, the mainstream media does try and use that as a negative, but only for protests they disagree with. Just like Justin Trudeau, when he said that, oh no, I've gone to protests that I support, like Black Lives Matter, but I don't support the truckers and their desire for individual freedom. Kyle says, I read a story that the Ottawa mayor has ties to the WEF and spoke at one of their seminars. I believe that's true, but I don't have the sources in front of me. Honestly, guys, if you want to really go down a rabbit hole, and I'll do a special episode eventually on this, but like a lot of Canadian politicians at every level are involved with the World Economic Forum Young Leader Initiative, or I forget exactly, Young Leader League or something like that. And again, it's far more than you expect. And we did share that clip previously on the one special episode I did, where Klaus Schwab was bragging back in 2017, I believe it was, that he had penetrated over 50% of the Liberal cabinet at that time. And I actually just today ordered on Amazon Chrystia Freeland's book she wrote back in 2010, which I believe was a criticism of the plutocrats. But don't worry, she eventually just joined them, right? If you can't beat them, join them. I think that's how the old saying goes. And again, I'm looking forward to reading that book and diving deep into it. I'll definitely share my thoughts, my opinions, and some of the quips and quotes from it once I get that book in my hands. But it turned out it only had one review on Amazon, which was strange. And it was actually tough to get. And there was like $9 in additional charge. I spent $50 on her book. Anyways, but thanks, bro. Appreciate it, Tony. Dave says, good evening, all. Richard, well, I guess I'm funding sedition. What a fucking joke. Again, right now, this is all seems bizarre and clown worldish, but understand that there was that controversy, right, back when the Tea Party in the United States and essentially the IRS went after them. Is it that hard of a stretch to think that when we've got our politicians speaking with the sort of language and divisiveness that they currently are, to not expect to almost see that happen here in Canada with the CRA? Yeah, we'll see how that plays out. Yeah, political suicide, rip GoFundMe. Absolutely. I will never support another GoFundMe again, ever. Like, just that needs to be a line in the sand. Because again, if they're going to be a partisanship fundraising platform, they need to own it. Hey, we only support liberal causes. We only support progressive causes. We only support, sedition or protests or riots when it's in the United States, right? We only support criminals when they're from Black Lives Matter leadership, which were allowed to have fundraisers even when they had been charged with violent crimes, even though Kyle Rittenhouse wasn't allowed to get access to his funds. Sandra says, I agree. This is a well-organized people. Absolutely. Again, like I said at the top of the show, wildly impressed with the leadership and all the participants in the Freedom Convoy. You guys are absolutely amazing Canadians, and I haven't felt this proud to be a Canadian ever. Literally ever. What's the story with Blocked Bridge? I'm not sure specifically which bridge we're talking about, but if you're talking about the Ambassador Bridge, there's a link in the video description down below, but it sounded like protesters were organizing there and planning a blockade. The mainstream media is no longer relevant. Energy is seniors find our news on the internet. Energy is seniors find our news. Yeah, I definitely think everyone should be finding their news through a multitude of sources, right? Again, I do like going to the mainstream. I like going to citizen journalists. I like going to Twitter and trying to synthesize the truth between all those. Gary says, I have concerns for public safety in gatherings with fireworks and explosive fuels. Yeah, that's reasonable. But again, if they've been handling it appropriately, and to the best of my knowledge, there's no reason to think that they haven't been handling it appropriately up until this point. One, because there's been no incidents. But two, like, we do have like fire marshals and stuff like that, right? That I think would call it out if it was an issue. But again, we'll see. Maybe it turns out that they were handling it inappropriately. Appreciate the updates. Gary says, risk equals choice. Take drugs or booze or medicine. I don't care what you do. I care what I do. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that every individual should be allowed the freedom to make their own health choices, to make their own association choices, to, again, like, life has never been 100% risk-free. It never will be 100% risk-free, and to pretend otherwise is a disservice to all of us. And so at this moment in time, I can't help but feel that the government is willing to sacrifice everything in the hopes of just getting slightly safer. And again, we'll see how this all plays out. But yeah, I agree with that sentiment, Gary. Comedian Benny Wills has his weekly YouTube show, Meme Mondays, starting in 93 minutes. It is amusing. All right, cool. Never heard of it, but great to hear that there's some other people enjoying their memes. COVID is a setup for authoritarianism. It definitely feels that way. More cowbell, 100% agree. Buy Bitcoin. Absolutely. If you guys have been, for whatever reason, on the fence throughout this and wanting to get involved in Bitcoin, if you don't trust your government, and I don't know how you could 100% trust any government, let alone our current government, Bitcoin is one of the ways that you can focus on building up your financial sovereignty, right? If you don't understand how we've seen this play out in the past, right? We've seen American politicians, American CEOs, we've seen military leaders in the US literally be cut off from their banking or credit cards. We've seen people cut off from their GoFundMes because when the state has access and control over the money, they're inherently going to use that at some point in time. And while honestly, up until this moment in time, it appears that the government hasn't been overly authoritarian with the implementation of that in Canada, it honestly only feels like a matter of time, particularly when we look at the language and rhetoric that they're using these days against anyone that disagrees with them. In vaccine passports, 100% agree. In vax mandates, agree. I watched him today. The man was disgusting. I'm not sure who that's referring to, but yeah, his language was awful today. Peter, or the Hungarian Experiment, says, show Matt some love, smash the like button, appreciate it. Lockdowns over the sniffles while billionaires rake in billions. Absolutely. This has been one of the largest, it probably is the largest wealth transfer in the history of humanity. And it does a disservice to the lower class, the middle class, even the upper middle class. Like, it's only the billionaires right now that are really reaping the benefits from this. Now, in Canada, we've seen a lot of property appreciation, right? And so real estate investors, in theory, probably feel like they're making out well. But understand that that's actually just your dollar losing value. It's not really real estate going up that much, and it's only loose monetary policy. This ends only one of a couple ways. Eventually, we're going to have to take our medicine when it comes to monetary policy, or we're literally at some point in time going to default on our debt, right, and our obligations. And when a government defaults on those sort of things, it becomes very difficult for your average person to trust them again. And it takes a while for them to build up that trust. Look back to like Argentina, right? I need to refresh on my own history here, but like, wasn't it in the 1910s or 1920s or sometime around that time? Like, Argentina was on a great trajectory to become a very powerful government and a very robust economy. And they made some very poor financial and monetary policy decisions, and that essentially destroyed their economy and the trust in their economy from outside investors and participants, like economic participants. And so because of that, to this day, they still struggled to a certain extent because of that. Now, again, they rebounded at one point in time, and then I believe they defaulted again, and that cycle continues. Project LB52 in the chat. Elizabeth, as always, really appreciate you, Matt. Appreciate you guys. I'm going to read one or two more, and then I'll wrap up. But everybody in the protest should carry around a jug of any kind. Yeah, I saw a lot of protesters were doing that. One guy was drinking Gatorade out of a jerry can. Now, if you're going to do that, please make sure the jerry can's never been used before. Also, please make sure that no one misguides it and thinks it's fuel and then accidentally pours it in their fuel tank, because that would also be a real pain in the butt. It does not matter if it's a proper jerry can. Local residents who support the convoy should donate jerry cans or other kinds of jugs, but please do not carry fuel in an unimproved jugs. The police will be unable to deal with thousands of people carrying jugs on the streets. If they try it, it will be a huge distraction that will keep them from doing other kinds of harassment. Yeah. Appreciate you sharing that, James. And never listened here before. Does the host interact with chat during live stream? We do it after I get through my spiel. So appreciate you, Erkon, joining us for this live stream. And yeah, I try and read most or all the chats after the fact. Charlottesville, except it's inverted. It does sort of feel that way. At the end, he goes through, okay, yep, awesome. Elizabeth, you know what kills me? The left has been pissing on anyone who compares what's going on in the world to the Holocaust, and yet they're the first to call anyone protesting a Nazi. I got called a Nazi. Yeah, and usually once we start bringing up Nazis, it immediately, like, what was that rule on the internet, right? The moment someone brings up Nazi, you've lost the argument. But I think that to just jump to conclusions and immediately say it's the Holocaust, I think is an exaggeration. But to compare policy versus policy, Like, there are arguments to be made to some of the restrictions in 1933. We've had certain Holocaust survivors, right, speak out and say how they don't like what they see going on in regards to these mandates and rules. Now, again, it's a complicated, complex situation, but it's important to understand that that freedom, to me at least, is one of the cornerstones of any prosperous society. And as we continue to see the erosion of individual freedoms and liberties, we're going to see the erosion of the prosperity and abundance that we have known for so long. And that really concerns me. As I've talked about, The Rational Optimist does a great job of discussing this. Look to any Austrian economics books, right, or speakers. And again, it doesn't take long to understand this. I know that some people bring up like modern monetary theory and stuff like that. I've got a fundamental disagreement there because, like the Austrians, I view it as money primarily as a means of exchange. And when the government has a monopoly on the means of exchange, bad things eventually happen. It creates all sorts of perversions in the economy. It creates disincentives. In fact, I went on a giant rant on a new podcast that me and Peter, the Hungarian Experiment, are shooting. So I'll leave that rant for you guys to check out on that podcast when it comes out. But appreciate those of you guys watching this video. As always, sharing is caring. So if you enjoy this content, please consider sharing it. If you hate watching this on Facebook or YouTube, reminder, I upload the replays of this on Rumble, and now we're also going to start uploading on BitChute, so you guys can check out the Maple Pill there. And then finally, it is Monday night. I went pretty long here, but I will be going live at 8:20 with just my hangout show. Again, it's the mailbag show now, so if you guys send me a piece of mail, I got a piece of mail this weekend, so appreciate it. I'll open it up, read it out. Again, link to the mailing address in the video description down below. If you guys want to send us a postcard, a little trinket, whatever it is, just good vibes only, ideally. And yeah, I look forward to hanging out with you guys in, I guess, 3 or 4 minutes. And otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow night, same time, same place, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll probably get back to our regular programming where I take you through a full course of the blue pill, the red pill, the black pill, the clown pill, and then finally the white pill when it comes to understanding WTF is going on in this world. I appreciate you guys. And again, just a reminder, you're not alone, right? Despite what maybe the mainstream media says, what your politicians say, what maybe even some friends and family say. You're not crazy. You're not alone. Seeking the truth is fundamental to the human experience, in my opinion. And I appreciate those of you that are in search of the truth. And again, this is just me kind of documenting my search for the truth and trying to share it with you guys as well. So yeah, enough. I'll wrap up and I'll see you guys in a couple minutes.